I am Nicole Cook, 38 years old, a major in the Special Forces who has spent half her life in the harshest conflict zones of the Middle East. I was trained to spot an enemy from a mile away, but I failed to recognize the most dangerous one sleeping right inside my own sister's house. The day I returned to New York to surprise Lily for her birthday, the thing that welcomed me was not her smile, but the cold, rhythmic beeping of a ventilator in the ICU at Lenox Hill Hospital. My sister lay there in a deep coma, diagnosed as a victim of a traffic accident. But the real shock hit me when I unlocked my phone. While Lily was fighting for every single breath, Mark, her model husband, was checking in on my family's yacht, a glass of champagne in his hand, laughing with a group of strangers. Not a single tear, not a single phone call. He thinks he married a naive artist and has a sister-in-law who is just a soldier following orders. He's wrong. He has just ignited a war he has no chance of winning. Let me know where you are tuning in from in the comments, and hit that subscribe button if you believe that a traitor to the family deserves a sentence far more brutal than any enemy on the front lines. I maneuvered my Ford F-150 Raptor through the gridlocked traffic of Manhattan. This truck was built for desert terrain, not the suffocating concrete canyons of the city. But I refused to drive anything else. On the passenger seat sat a white box from Magnolia Bakery. Inside was a red velvet cake, Lily's absolute favorite. I glanced at it and forced a smile, adjusting the collar of my uniform. I wanted Lily to see that her big sister was strong, tough, but still remembered the little things that made her smile. I had made a quick stop at a corner bodega to grab a bundle of sunflowers, their bright yellow petals a stark contrast to the gray city. My mind drifted back to our last FaceTime call. Lily had looked thin, her collarbones protruding sharply, and there were dark circles under her eyes that even the grainy video couldn't hide. Yet she had smiled that soft, wavering smile and said, "I'm fine, Nick. Really?" I cursed myself for believing that lie. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I should have known. That smile wasn't happiness. It was makeup applied over a bruised soul. I looked at the cake box again. The frosting was probably starting to melt in the heat of the cab, a small ruinous detail that made my stomach turn. I pulled up to the townhouse on the Upper East Side. It was a $4 million fortress of limestone and brick, standing tall but completely soulless. The heavy drapes were drawn tight even though it was past noon. I marched up the steps and pressed the doorbell. Once, twice. Silence answered me. It was a heavy, leaden silence that felt wrong. I knelt down and felt under the heavy ceramic planter by the door. An old habit, a secret spare key we had kept since we were kids. My fingers brushed cold metal. I unlocked the door and pushed it open. I expected the soothing scent of lavender candles, the smell that always defined Lily's home. Instead, I was hit by a wall of stagnant air. It smelled of mildew, stale bourbon, and cold cigarette smoke, a smell Lily detested. My combat instincts flared. I stepped inside, my boots heavy on the hardwood floor. In the hallway, an easel had been knocked over. A canvas lay face down, and a tube of red paint had split open, smearing across the floor like dried blood. A General Patton quote flashed through my mind about executing a plan violently rather than waiting. I didn't call out. I moved. This wasn't a home anymore. It was a crime scene. I moved through the house, my eyes scanning for threats. The kitchen was a disaster. The sink was piled high with dishes that had fuzzy green mold growing on the edges. But it was the refrigerator that broke me. Stuck to the stainless steel door was a solitary yellow sticky note. In Lily's handwriting, shaky and small, it read, "Happy birthday to me." My chest tightened. She had been alone. I turned to the trash can in the corner of the home office. A piece of printer paper was crumpled into a tight ball sitting right on top. I pulled it out and smoothed it against the granite counter. It was a divorce petition, half-filled, abandoned, stained with what looked like a teardrop. I pulled out my phone and dialed Mark, straight to voicemail. I dialed Lily. A muffled ringing sound echoed from the living room. I followed the sound to the sofa. Her phone was wedged deep under the cushions. Why would she leave without her phone? Or was she unable to take it? Suddenly, the landline on the kitchen wall screamed, cutting through the silence. I grabbed it, my voice dropping to a command tone. Hello? Is this the residence of Lily Collins? This is Lenox Hill Hospital Emergency Department. 15 minutes later, I was sprinting through the sterile white corridors of the ICU. The rhythmic beep, beep, beep of the machines was the only sound that welcomed me. And there she was. My little sister looked so small, lost in a forest of tubes and wires, her head wrapped in thick white bandages. A nurse looked up from a chart, her eyes filled with weary pity. You must be the sister? Thank God. Finally, someone is here. The word finally hit me like a physical blow. I looked around the small room. The chair designated for family members was pushed against the wall. It was empty. There was no suit jacket draped over it, no half-drunk cup of coffee, no Mark. My sister was fighting for her life, hanging by a thread. And the man who stood at the altar and vowed to hold her in sickness and in health was nowhere to be found. I looked at the empty chair, and the sadness in my heart instantly calcified into a cold, hard rage. I reached out and gently took Lily's hand. It was ice cold, limp against my calloused palm. As I rubbed her skin, trying to transfer some of my warmth to her, my thumb brushed against something raised and jagged on the inside of her wrist. I froze. It wasn't a fresh wound from the accident. It was a scar. A faint, silvery line that had healed poorly. I stared at that mark, and the sterile white walls of the ICU dissolved. Suddenly, I was back in the mahogany-paneled living room of our parents' estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. It was Thanksgiving last year. I had arrived straight from the airfield, still wearing my operational camouflage pattern uniform, smelling of jet fuel and exhaustion. I hadn't even had time to change. In contrast, Mark was standing by the fireplace, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon, looking like he had just stepped out of a magazine spread. He wore a Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than my entire year's salary. When I walked in, the room went quiet. Mark turned, flashed that perfect veneered smile, and raised his glass. Well, well, he announced, his voice booming so everyone could hear. Look who finally decided to join civilization. G.I. Jane is home. A ripple of awkward laughter went through the room. I felt my jaw tighten. Good to see you, Mark, I said, trying to keep the peace for Lily's sake. He didn't let up. He walked over to the window and pointed at my truck parked in the driveway. My pride and joy, the Ford F-150 Raptor. You're still driving that thing? It looks like a fertilizer truck, Nicole. Honestly, it's an eyesore in this neighborhood. Why don't you get a real job instead of playing security guard for old men in Washington? I could get you an entry-level position as a receptionist at my firm. You'd make more money. My blood boiled. I took a step forward, my fists clenching. I wanted to break his nose right there in front of the turkey and the cranberry sauce. But before I could move, a small hand grabbed my arm. It was Lily. She looked terrified. She pulled me toward the back garden, her eyes wide and pleading. Please, Nick, she whispered, her voice trembling. Mark is just joking. That's just his sense of humor. He's under a lot of pressure right now with the venture capital fund. I looked at my little sister. She wasn't defending me, she was managing him. Pressure gives him the right to be a prick? I asked. Lily looked down at her shoes. He says I don't understand money. He says I'm bad with finances, so I signed over control of Grandpa's trust fund to him. He's investing it for our future. He's really smart, Nick. I stood there in the cold autumn air, stunned. Our grandfather's trust fund was substantial. It was supposed to be her safety net. You did what? He loves me, she said. But she sounded like she was trying to convince herself. That was the moment I should have screamed. That was the moment I should have dragged her out of that marriage. But I didn't. I stayed silent because I didn't want to ruin the holiday. I didn't realize then that it wasn't love. It was a hostile takeover. Mark had isolated Lily, stripping away her financial independence piece by piece until she was just a doll he could keep on a shelf. And it got worse. Later that evening, I overheard Mark talking to our parents in the library. I'm worried about Nicole, Mark said, his voice dripping with fake concern. Women who spend that much time in combat zones, they come back wrong. Unstable. You know the stats on PTSD? Honestly, I don't think she should be managing her own inheritance when the time comes. For her own safety, maybe I should help oversee her share too. I listened from the hallway, feeling bile rise in my throat. He wasn't just insulting me, he was strategically dismantling my credibility. He was planting seeds of doubt in my parents' minds, painting me as the crazy war veteran so that if I ever tried to expose him, no one would believe me. He was terrified of me. He knew I was the only one who could see through his shiny exterior to the predator underneath. Back in the hospital room, the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor pulled me back to the present. I looked at Lily's bruised face, at the tubes keeping her alive. I should have seen it, I whispered, a tear escaping and tracking through the dust on my cheek. I should have swallowed my pride and dragged you out of that house. But I hadn't. I had chosen to go back to the Middle East because dodging bullets in the desert was easier than dealing with the sneering contempt of my brother-in-law and the passivity of my family. I had run away. And because I ran, my sister was lying here, broken. The guilt hit me harder than any shrapnel ever could. But as I wiped the tear from my face, the guilt hardened into something else, something useful. Mark thought he had neutralized me. He thought G.I. Jane was too stupid to understand his game. He thought he could steal my sister's money, break her spirit, and then leave her for dead while he partied on a yacht. I want to ask you guys something real quick. Have you ever known someone like Mark? Someone who isolates their partner from family and controls all the money while pretending to be the perfect spouse? If you have, hit that like button and type yes in the comments. Let me know I'm not the only one seeing this red flag. I stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. I wasn't crying anymore. The sadness was gone, replaced by the cold, calculating focus of a soldier entering a kill box. He wanted a war? He was about to get one. But first, I needed to know exactly where he was. I picked up my phone. It was time to go hunting. My phone vibrated violently against the hard plastic of the hospital chair, the sound echoing like a drill in the quiet ICU room. I ignored it at first, my eyes fixed on the slow rise and fall of Lily's chest. It buzzed again. And again. A persistent, demanding rhythm that refused to be sidelined. I picked it up, expecting a call from our parents, or maybe, just maybe, Mark finally returning my 100th call. But the screen was dark. It was a notification. I rarely used social media. In my line of work, digital footprints were a liability. I kept a ghost account on Instagram solely to keep an eye on Lily, who loved posting her paintings and her perfect life in the city. But this notification wasn't from Lily. It was a suggested post, the algorithm doing its terrifyingly accurate job. Mark Collins was just tagged in a post by Candy Baby 99. Candy Baby 99. The handle alone made my stomach turn. A soldier's intuition is a real thing. It's a prickle on the back of your neck before an IED goes off. I felt that prickle now. My finger hovered over the screen for a second, trembling slightly, before I tapped the notification. The screen flared to life, the brightness blinding in the dim hospital room. The image that loaded was high definition, saturated with color and sunlight. It assaulted my eyes. The geotag read, Montauk, the Hamptons. The timestamp, 2 hours ago. While I had been tearing down the I-95 corridor, breaking every speed limit to get to my dying sister, Mark was at the beach. I zoomed in on the photo. Mark was standing on the deck of a boat. Not just any boat, but the Sea Witch, my father's 40-foot yacht. He was wearing a pair of Vilebrequin swim trunks that cost more than most people's rent. In one hand, he held a bottle of Dom Perignon. The cork already popped, foam spilling over his manicured fingers. He was laughing, his head thrown back, exposing that gummy upper lip I had always found repulsive. But he wasn't alone. Pressed against his side was a girl who couldn't have been older than 22. She was tan, blonde, and wearing a neon pink bikini that barely covered anything. She was kissing Mark's cheek, her hand resting possessively on his chest. I felt a wave of nausea, but I forced myself to look closer. My training kicked in. Analyze the target. Look for details. My eyes moved from the girl's face to her neck. My breath hitched in my throat. I dropped the phone onto the cushion beside me as if it were a live coal. Around the girl's neck was a single strand of pearls. But they weren't just costume jewelry. They were creamy, luminous, perfectly round Akoya pearls, with a distinctive diamond-encrusted clasp shaped like a rose. They were Mikimoto pearls. My mother had given those pearls to Lily on her wedding day. They were a family heirloom, passed down 3 generations. Lily never took them off. She called them her lucky charm. I looked at Lily's neck on the hospital bed. It was bare. Mark hadn't just cheated. He had looted my sister's body. He had taken her most precious possession, a symbol of our family's love and history, and draped it around the neck of some random party girl in the Hamptons. I picked the phone up again, my grip crushing the case. I read the caption below the photo. Freedom, finally. New life. No more chains. No more chains. That was what he called her. My sweet, artistic, loving sister was a chain holding him back from his life of debauchery. He wasn't just absent, he was celebrating. He was popping champagne to toast her impending death. He believed she wasn't coming back, and he was already spending her inheritance and erasing her existence. The blood in my veins turned into liquid fire. It was the same adrenaline surge I felt during an ambush in Kabul, the moment fear evaporates and is replaced by pure, crystallized aggression. I hit the call button on Mark's contact. It rang, once, twice. Then, the ringing stopped abruptly. He didn't let it go to voicemail. He hit the decline button. He had the phone in his hand. He saw Nicole on the screen. He knew his wife was in the ICU. And he pressed decline so he wouldn't interrupt his party. I stared at the phone, my vision blurring not with tears, but with red-hot rage. This wasn't human behavior. This was predatory. This was evil. You think you're free, Mark? I whispered to the empty room. You have no idea what kind of cage you just stepped into. I stood up and walked to the small sink in the corner of the room. I splashed cold water on my face, washing away the dust of the drive and the salt of my tears. When I looked up at the mirror, the worried sister was gone. Major Nicole Cook stared back. My jaw was set. My eyes were cold steel. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone again. I didn't call Mark this time. I scrolled down to a number I hadn't used in 2 years. Jack Harlan. Jack was ex-Army intelligence, a man who could find a needle in a haystack in the middle of a tornado. He was now the most feared private investigator in New York City. I tapped the number. He picked up on the second ring. Major. Jack's gravelly voice came through, sounding surprised. It's been a while. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I recited a verse from Psalm 144 in my head. Blessed be the Lord my rock, who trains my hands for war, my fingers for battle. And then I spoke. I need a target package, Jack, I said, my voice devoid of emotion. Name is Mark Collins, Greenwich and Upper East Side. What are we looking for? Jack asked, his tone shifting instantly to professional alert. Everything, I said, looking at Lily's broken form. I want to know what he eats, who he sleeps with, and exactly how much money he owes. I want his bank statements, his gambling debts, his crypto wallets. I want to know the name of the girl he's with right now in Montauk. Consider it done, Jack said. How deep do you want me to dig? I looked at the empty chair where a husband should have been sitting. Dig until you hit hell, Jack, I replied. And then keep digging. The neon sign of the diner in Queens flickered with a dying buzz, casting a sickly yellow light onto the wet pavement. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. Inside, the air smelled of burnt coffee and grease. I sat in a vinyl booth that had seen better decades, nursing a mug of black coffee that tasted like battery acid. Jack Harlan slid into the seat opposite me. He didn't say hello. He just dropped a thick manila folder onto the sticky table with a heavy thud. You are not going to like this, Major, Jack said, signaling the waitress for coffee. In fact, you're going to want to kill him. I opened the folder. The first page was a summary of Mark's financials. I scanned the numbers, and my blood ran cold. Mark Collins wasn't a venture capital genius. He was a degenerate gambler masquerading as a Wall Street shark. The high-yield funds he bragged about were nothing but a Ponzi scheme he was running to cover his own losses. He had torched $5 million in the last 18 months. He had bet against the market, poured money into obscure cryptocurrencies that went to zero, and lost a fortune betting on college football and the NFL. "It gets worse," Jack said, pointing to a document near the back. "Look at the signature." I pulled out a legal document. It was a general power of attorney. It gave Mark full control over Lily's assets, health decisions, and real estate. The date was from 6 months ago, right around the time Lily had a severe flu. "He either forged it or tricked her into signing it when she was medicated," Jack explained. "He used this to mortgage the townhouse to the hilt. He drained her savings. He even liquidated the retirement fund your parents set up for her. On paper, Nicole, your sister is homeless and bankrupt. He spent it all." I closed the folder. My hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the effort it took not to flip the table. "He stole everything." "Everything," Jack confirmed. "And he's currently trying to secure a hard money loan using your parents' estate as collateral, claiming he has influence over them." I threw a $100 bill on the table. "Keep digging, Jack. I need to go to Greenwich." The sun was just beginning to bleed into the sky when I pulled up the long gravel driveway of my parents' estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. This place was the definition of old money: quiet, understated, and terrifyingly powerful. I found my parents in the library. My father, a retired colonel, was sitting in his leather armchair, while my mother, the steel matriarch of Connecticut society, was pacing by the window. I laid it all out. The photos from the Hamptons, the gambling debts, the power of attorney, the fact that Lily was currently lying in a coma while her husband spent her last dime on champagne and women. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she sank onto the sofa. But my father didn't say a word. He stood up slowly, walked over to the locked cabinet in the corner, and pulled out his Remington shotgun. He cracked the barrel open to check the load. "I'm going to kill him," my father said. His voice wasn't loud, it was a matter-of-fact statement. "I'm going to drive to New York and put a hole in his chest." I stepped in front of him, placing a hand on the cold steel of the barrel. "No, Dad. He hurt my daughter, Nicole. He destroyed her. And if you shoot him, you go to prison and he becomes a victim," I said, my voice steady. "Bullets are too quick for a man like Mark. He worships money. He worships status. If we want to hurt him, we don't use lead. We use gold." My father hesitated, then lowered the gun. "What do you have in mind?" I looked at them both. "We execute an economic siege. We don't call the police yet. That takes too long. Instead, we use the family holding company. We buy up his debt." I laid out the strategy. Mark's debts were toxic. The banks and loan sharks were desperate to get rid of them. My family had the liquidity to buy those notes for pennies on the dollar. "Once we own his debt, we become his primary creditor," I explained, my eyes narrowing. "We can call in the loans immediately. We foreclose on the townhouse. We repossess the Porsche. We seize the yacht he is currently partying on. We strip him naked before we even hand him over to the DA. We turn him into a pauper." A shift occurred in the room. The grief evaporated, replaced by the ruthless efficiency that had kept my family wealthy for generations. My father nodded, a grim smile touching his lips. "I'll call the lawyers. We'll own him by noon." I turned to leave. I had to get back to the hospital. But as I reached the door, my mother called out, "Nicole." I turned. My mother, who had always criticized my combat boots and my lack of a husband, who had called me rough and unladylike, walked over to me. Her eyes were red, but her chin was high. She reached for my hand. She slid a ring off her own finger, a heavy vintage diamond ring that had belonged to her grandmother. She pressed it into my palm and closed my fingers over it. "I used to think you made a mistake joining the army," she whispered, her voice fierce. "I thought I had lost you to a world I didn't understand. But today I thank God that you are a soldier." She gripped my hand tight. "You go back there, Nicole. You go back there and you tear him apart. Do it for your sister. Do it for the honor of this house. I looked at the ring, then at my mother. For the first time in 38 years, I didn't feel like the black sheep. I felt like the protector. I will, Mom, I said. I'm going to war. I walked out to my truck. The morning air was crisp. I had the intel. I had the funding. And now, I had the mandate. Mark Collins had no idea that the sun was rising on his last day of freedom. It was day 4 in the intensive care unit. The air was recycled and cold, smelling of antiseptic and despair. I hadn't slept in 36 hours. I was fueled by black hospital coffee and the weight of the diamond ring my mother had pressed into my hand, a tangible reminder that the cavalry had arrived, even if they weren't in the room. Then the heavy double doors swung open. The leading actor had finally arrived on set. Mark stumbled into the room. If I didn't know better, I would have felt sorry for him. His hair was a bird's nest of tangles. His usually crisp dress shirt was untucked, hanging loosely over wrinkled trousers. His eyes were red-rimmed and puffy. It was a perfect costume for the role of the devastated husband. "Oh God, Lily!" he wailed, rushing toward the bed, his voice cracking theatrically. "My sweet girl! Why? Why did this happen?" I stood in the corner, arms crossed, watching him with the detached focus of a sniper tracking a target. I saw what others missed. I saw the way he checked his reflection in the glass partition before rushing in. I saw the venti Starbucks cup clutched in his hand. That cup made my blood boil. He had walked past a dozen nurses, walked past me, the woman who had been keeping vigil for 4 days straight, and he hadn't brought a water, a coffee, or a donut for anyone but himself. Even in his grief, Mark Collins only thought about his own thirst. He lunged forward to grab Lily's hand, the same hand I had been holding for hours. I moved. I intercepted him before he reached the bedside, stepping between him and my sister like a physical shield. I grabbed his wrist. My grip was iron. "Don't touch her," I said, my voice low and vibrating with menace. "Do not touch her with those filthy hands." Mark froze. The weeping husband mask slipped for a split second, revealing the sneering narcissist underneath. He yanked his arm away and straightened up, looking me up and down with that familiar look of disdain. "What the hell are you doing here, G.I. Jane?" he spat, his voice dropping so the nurse's station wouldn't hear. "Don't you have a mission somewhere? Shouldn't you be killing people in a desert instead of harassing me?" I leaned in. The smell hit me instantly. Beneath the aggressive scent of wintergreen breath mints, I could smell it. The sour, stale stench of expensive gin and the cloying floral note of a woman's perfume. Bond number 9. Not Lily's brand. "You reek, Mark," I said. "You smell like booze and cheap decisions." He didn't flinch. He adjusted his collar, regaining his arrogance. "I was working, Nicole. I was out of town trying to close a deal to pay for her medical bills." He gestured to Lily. "While you stand here playing soldier, I'm the one paying for the electricity keeping her alive." The audacity was breathtaking. He was paying with her money. I stepped closer, invading his personal space. I wanted him to feel the threat. I saw the pictures, Mark. Montauk, the boat, the champagne, and the girl wearing my mother's pearls. For a heartbeat, fear flickered in his eyes. His Adam's apple bobbed. I had him. I was ready to drag him out into the hallway and expose him to the world. But I underestimated him. Mark wasn't just a thief. He was a predator who knew how to use his prey's weaknesses against them. He suddenly stumbled back, throwing his hands up in a defensive posture. He turned his head toward the nurse's station and raised his voice, pitching it perfectly to sound terrified. "Nurse! Nurse! Please help!" A heavy-set nurse hurried over, looking alarmed. "What is going on here? You need to keep it down." Mark pointed a shaking finger at me. I'm so sorry. It's my sister-in-law. She has severe PTSD from her time in the service." He looked at the nurse with pleading, tear-filled eyes. "She's paranoid. She's hallucinating things about me. She gets aggressive and confusing. I'm afraid she's going to hurt my wife during one of her episodes. Please, I just want to be with Lily." My jaw dropped. I stood there, stunned. He had taken my service, my sacrifice, and the very real scars I carried, and he had weaponized them. He had turned me into the crazy veteran stereotype in under 10 seconds. The nurse's demeanor changed instantly. The sympathy she had shown me for days evaporated, replaced by caution and fear. She looked at my uniform, then at the grieving husband. "Major," the nurse said, her voice firm and authoritative. "I think it would be best if you stepped outside for a while. Let Mr. Collins have some time with his wife. You seem agitated." "He's lying," I said, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. "He was in the Hamptons with a mistress 2 hours ago." "She's delusional," Mark whispered to the nurse, shaking his head sadly. "See? She thinks I'm partying while my wife is dying. It's the trauma talking." The nurse stepped between us, shielding Mark. "Major, please, don't make me call security. Step outside, now." I looked at Mark. He was hiding behind the nurse's shoulder, and there it was, a tiny, imperceptible smirk playing on his lips. He had won. He had used the system, the social norms, and my own history to cast me out. My hand drifted to my side. For a split second, the urge to end him was so strong my vision blurred red. I could break him. I could end this charade right now. But if I did, I would prove him right. I would be the violent, unstable soldier he painted me to be, and Lily would be left alone with a monster. I took a deep breath, forcing the adrenaline down. I swallowed the bile in my throat. "Fine," I said, smoothing my jacket. I looked past the nurse, locking eyes with Mark. "You're a great actor, Mark," I said, my voice ice cold. "But you forgot one thing. The play isn't over yet, and the final act? It's going to be a tragedy for you." I turned on my heel and walked out. I left him there, holding the hand of the woman he was trying to kill. But as the doors swung shut behind me, I wasn't defeated. I was liberated. Because now I knew exactly what kind of enemy I was fighting. And the rules of engagement had just changed. The hospital at 2 a.m. is a different world. The chaotic hum of the day fades into a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the squeak of rubber shoes on linoleum and the distant hum of ventilation systems. I was sitting in the waiting area, staring at a vending machine without really seeing it, when Dr. David signaled to me. David had been our family physician for 20 years. He treated my scraped knees when I was a kid and monitored my father's blood pressure. But tonight, he didn't look like a family friend. He looked terrified. "Nicole," he whispered, glancing up and down the hallway. "Come with me, now." He led me into the on-call room and locked the door behind us. The click of the lock echoed loudly in the small space. He didn't offer me a seat. He just walked to a desk and pulled out a printout of a lab report. "I shouldn't be showing you this," David said, his voice tight. "Technically, Mark is her next of kin. But I can't sleep with what I found." He handed me the paper. It was a chaotic mess of medical abbreviations and numbers. I ran a retrospective analysis on the blood sample the paramedics drew the moment they brought Lily in. David explained, tapping a specific line with a shaking finger. "Look at her glucose levels at the time of admission." I squinted at the number. 30 milligrams per deciliter. 30, David repeated grimly. "Nicole, a normal person is around 100. At 30, the brain shuts down. You suffer confusion, seizures, and loss of consciousness. Lily didn't fall asleep at the wheel. She went into severe hypoglycemic shock." I frowned, confusion warring with the dread rising in my gut. "But that makes no sense. Nobody in our family is diabetic. Lily has never taken insulin in her life." David looked me dead in the eye. "Exactly. That is why I ran a C-peptide test. It tells us if the insulin in her body was made by her pancreas or if it came from outside." He took a deep breath. Her insulin levels were 20 times the normal limit, and it was exogenous. "Exogenous?" I asked, the word feeling heavy on my tongue. "It means injected," David said. "Someone injected her with a massive dose of insulin. It drops blood sugar instantly. It mimics a stroke or a fainting spell. And the terrifying part? It metabolizes out of the system in hours. If I hadn't tested that specific sample from the crash site, we would never have found it. It would have looked like a tragic accident." The room seemed to spin. I grabbed the edge of the desk to steady myself. This wasn't an accident, I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. This was an assassination. Suddenly, the pieces of the puzzle slammed together with a sickening clarity. The $5 million in debt, the desperate need for cash, and the life insurance policy. I remembered when Lily signed it. It was a standard $2 million policy, something my father insisted on for tax purposes. Mark was the sole beneficiary. The timeline played out in my head like a horror movie. Mark knew he was drowning in debt. He knew he was about to lose everything. So, he concocted a plan. He didn't use a gun or a knife. Those leave evidence. He used medicine. He probably waited until the morning. Maybe he mixed it into her orange juice, or maybe, in a twisted act of care, he offered to give her a vitamin shot. He injected her with death, kissed her goodbye, and watched her get into her car, knowing that in 20 minutes she would lose consciousness on the highway. And while she was crashing into a concrete divider, fighting for her life, he was driving to the Hamptons to pop champagne bottles. I felt bile rise in my throat. I had to swallow hard to keep from vomiting. I had seen evil in war. I had seen men do unspeakable things to each other, but those men held rifles. They were enemies. They didn't share your bed. They didn't whisper, "I love you," while plotting your execution. This was a different kind of evil. It was intimate. It was domestic. It was the man who promised to protect you becoming the butcher. I need you to pause for a second. Imagine trusting someone with your life, letting them make your breakfast or handle your medicine, only to realize they were counting down the minutes until you died. If this sends a shiver down your spine, hit that like button and comment "Justice" below. Let's show Mark that the world is watching. I looked up at David. "Thank you," I said, my voice eerily calm. "You just gave me the weapon I needed." I walked back out into the hallway. I didn't go to Lily's room. I couldn't look at her right now without breaking down. I needed to be cold. I needed to be lethal. I pulled out my phone. The screen glowed in the semi-darkness. I opened my encrypted messaging app and found the thread with Jack Harlan. My fingers flew across the keyboard. Target package update. Disregard fraud investigation. I typed the next words slowly, savoring the weight of them. Classification: attempted murder. He used insulin. Find me the purchase trail. Find me the pharmacy. Find me a witness. I hit send. I am going to put him in the electric chair. The war for assets was over. The war for blood had just begun. Mark thought he had committed the perfect crime because he used an invisible weapon. But he forgot that even invisible things leave a shadow if you shine a bright enough light on them. And I was about to bring the sun. Mark Collins was feeling invincible as he sat at the best table in Le Bernardin, the sunlight filtering through the blinds to illuminate the crystal glasses and the remnants of a $500 lunch. Across from him sat a potential investor, a nervous man named Mr. Henderson, whom Mark was about to fleece for $250,000 in a new blockchain opportunity that did not actually exist. Mark flashed his winning smile, the one that had charmed Lily into signing over her inheritance, and leaned back in his chair. He felt like the king of New York. The waiter appeared with the leather check folder, and without even looking at the total, Mark pulled out his American Express Centurion card, the heavy titanium black card that was the ultimate status symbol of the elite, and dropped it onto the tray with a flourish of arrogance. He continued chatting with Gary, assuring him that this was a ground floor opportunity until the waiter returned. The young man didn't place the folder down discreetly. Instead, he stood awkwardly at the edge of the table, clearing his throat loud enough to silence the nearby conversations. Mark looked up, annoyed by the interruption, only to hear the waiter say the words that would mark the beginning of his end. The waiter apologized loudly, stating that the card had been declined. Mark froze, his face flushing a light shade of pink as he scoffed at the impossibility of it. He ordered the man to run it again, claiming the machine must be broken, but the waiter remained impassive. He informed Mark that they had run it 3 times and the code was 05. Desperate to save face in front of his Mark laughed nervously and pulled out his Platinum Visa, then his backup MasterCard. 1 minute later, the manager arrived at the table, his tone icy and final. He informed Mark that all the cards had come back declined, with a bank message stating the account was frozen by a creditor order. He demanded cash or threatened to call the authorities. Gary, the investor, didn't wait to hear the rest. He stood up, capped his pen, and walked out of the restaurant, leaving Mark sitting alone in the center of the dining room, humiliated and forced to scrape together $300 in loose cash from his wallet just to avoid being arrested over a halibut fillet. Seething with rage and confusion, Mark tore out of the parking garage in his Porsche 911. He needed to get to his safe. He kept $50,000 in cash in the wall safe at the townhouse for emergencies, and right now, this felt like an emergency. He sped uptown, weaving through traffic with reckless abandon, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He pulled up to the curb in front of the $4 million townhouse, marching up the steps and jamming his key into the lock. It wouldn't turn. He jiggled it, pulled it out, and tried again. But it was like the key belonged to a different house. He shouted in frustration and kicked the heavy oak door, and that was when he saw it. Stuck right at eye level on the mahogany wood was a bright orange sticker. It wasn't a note from the postman or a delivery slip. It was a legal notice stating that the property had been seized by the primary creditor, Cook Holdings, LLC, and that trespassing was prohibited. Before Mark could process the words, a black SUV with the logo of a private security firm screeched to a halt behind his Porsche. Two men stepped out, built like linebackers and wearing tactical vests. Mark screamed that this was his house, that his wife owned it. But the guard stepped forward, blocking the entrance with a wall of muscle. He calmly informed Mark that the bank had owned the house, and as of 9 o'clock that morning, Cook Holdings had bought the note and exercised the immediate repossession clause due to default. The guard's voice was devoid of sympathy as he told Mark that the locks had been changed, the alarm code reset, and that his Porsche was also on the list for repossession. Mark stumbled back down the stairs, standing on the sidewalk he used to walk down like a king. Now he was locked out, with no money, no investors. And the terrifying realization that the sister-in-law he had mocked as a stupid soldier had just outflanked him financially. He ducked into a nearby alleyway, his hands shaking so hard he almost dropped his phone as he dialed Victor Lang. Victor was a shark of a lawyer, the kind who could smell blood in the water from miles away. Mark hissed into the phone, begging for help, explaining that they had taken the house and frozen the accounts. There was a long silence on the other end of the line before Victor spoke. He told Mark that it was a brilliant move by the Cooks. By buying the debt, they legally had Mark by the throat, and fighting them in court would be a losing battle against their limitless resources. Mark shouted that he only had $200 left in his pocket and was destitute, asking if he should just roll over and die. Victor's voice turned smooth and predatory. He told Mark that they wouldn't fight in court, they would fight where the Cooks were weak. He explained that old money families hated noise and scandal. He instructed Mark to stop being the arrogant businessman and start being the victim. Victor laid out the plan. Go to the press, go to social media, get on camera with tears in his eyes, and tell the world that his billionaire in-laws were using their money to bully a grieving husband. The narrative would be that they kicked him out on the street while his wife was dying, simply because they didn't like him. Mark lowered the phone slowly, looking at his reflection in a shop window. He looked disheveled, desperate, and broken. He looked perfect for the role. A slow, twisted smile spread across his face. Nicole thought she had crushed him with money, but he realized he could crush her with lies. He hung up the phone and smoothed his hair down, not to make it neat, but to make it look even messier. He unbuttoned his top button. He was ready for his close-up. The war wasn't over. It had just moved to a new battlefield. The Manhattan civil court smelled of floor wax and old lies. I sat in the front row, my back rigid against the hard wooden bench, watching a nightmare unfold in slow motion. We were there for an emergency hearing regarding the asset freeze and the restraining order, but Mark's lawyer, Victor Lang, was turning it into a character assassination of me. Victor was good. I hated him, but he was good. He paced in front of the judge in a three-piece suit that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, weaving a narrative that made Mark look like a saint and my family look like vindictive tyrants. Your Honor, Victor boomed, his voice smooth as silk. "This is a clear case of a wealthy, powerful family bullying a grieving husband. My client, Mr. Collins, has been locked out of his own home and stripped of his dignity while his wife lies in a coma. And based on what evidence? The paranoid delusions of a sister-in-law who has spent too much time in war zones." He turned and pointed a manicured finger at me. "Major Cook sees enemies everywhere she looks. It is a tragedy, really. She accuses my client of injecting his wife with insulin, yet she has produced zero physical evidence. No syringe, no witnesses, no video. Just a conspiracy theory concocted to steal Mr. Collins's rightful assets." The judge, a gray-haired man with heavy spectacles, was nodding. He looked at me with pity, not belief. I gripped the edge of the bench until my knuckles turned white. Mark was sitting at the defense table, his head bowed in mock sorrow. But as Victor spoke, Mark turned slightly and caught my eye. He winked. A tiny, imperceptible smirk played on his lips. He knew he was winning. "Unless the plaintiff has something substantial," the judge said, looking at our family lawyer, "I am inclined to lift the freezing order and dismiss the—" Bang! The heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, hitting the wall with a thunderous crash that silenced the room. Every head turned. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. A nurse in blue scrubs pushed a wheelchair into the center aisle. Sitting in it was Lily. She looked frail, her body swallowed by a hospital gown and a thick wool blanket. Her head was still wrapped in heavy white bandages, and her face was pale as a sheet. But her eyes were wide open, and they were burning with a fire I hadn't seen in years. Mark stood up so fast his chair toppled over backward. His face drained of all color, leaving him looking like a wax figure. The smirk was gone, replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. "Objection!" Victor Lang shouted, losing his cool composure. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The victim is in critical condition. She has suffered brain trauma. Her memory is compromised. She is not a reliable witness." The judge banged his gavel. "Sit down, Mr. Lang. If Mrs. Collins is here, I want to hear what she has to say." Lily didn't look at Mark. She didn't look at me. She stared straight at the judge, her voice raspy but steady. "I don't remember the crash, Your Honor," Lily said, her voice echoing in the silent room. "I don't remember driving off the road. But I remember what my husband did the months before. And even if my memory is foggy, my computer remembers everything." Our lawyer, a sharp woman named Sarah, stepped forward holding an iPad. "Your Honor, 3 months ago, Mrs. Collins suspected her husband of infidelity. She installed a keylogger software on their shared laptop at home. It records every keystroke, every password, and every search query, syncing it directly to her personal iCloud account." Sarah connected the iPad to the large monitor on the courtroom wall. "This is the search history from Mark Collins's user profile on the night before the accident, between 10 o'clock at night and midnight." The screen flickered to life. The text was large, black, and damning. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. I felt the air leave my lungs. 10:05 p.m. Lethal dose of insulin for 110-pound female. 10:15 p.m. How to inject insulin without leaving a mark. 10:30 p.m. How long does synthetic insulin stay in bloodstream? 11:00 p.m. Life insurance payout timeline for accidental car death. The list went on. It wasn't just a search history, it was a blueprint for murder. It showed the cold, calculated planning of a man who sat on the couch next to his wife, typing into a search bar how to kill her while she probably slept in the next room. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the hum of the projector. The evidence hung in the air, undeniable and horrifying. Mark stood there, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The grieving husband mask had been ripped off, revealing the monster underneath. Victor Lang slumped into his chair. He closed his briefcase. He knew it was over. There was no spinning this. There was no PTSD defense for a Google search history that detailed a homicide plot. That is not what it looks like," Mark suddenly shouted, his voice shrill and desperate. He pointed at the screen, sweat pouring down his forehead. I was. I was researching for a medical investment. I was looking into biotech stocks. It was due diligence. It was the stupidest, most pathetic lie I'd ever heard. The judge looked at Mark over the rim of his glasses. The look of disgust on his face was absolute. He didn't even bother to respond to the outburst. He turned to the bailiff standing by the wall. "Officer," the judge said, his voice cold as ice, "please secure the defendant. I am holding him in contempt, and I recommend the district attorney take a very close look at this new evidence immediately." Two officers moved toward Mark. He tried to back away, looking around for an exit, but there was nowhere to run. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, the sound loud and final in the quiet room, Mark looked at Lily. She wasn't crying. She sat tall in her wheelchair, watching him with a look of utter indifference. She had saved herself. I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for a week. The weight on my chest vanished. I looked at Victor Lang, who was staring at his table, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. I looked at Mark, now being dragged toward the side door, shouting incoherent excuses. And then I looked at my sister. She turned her head slowly and met my gaze. She offered me a small, tired smile. We didn't need to say a word. The war was over. We had won. The judge's gavel hit the wood with a finality that echoed through the packed courtroom. 28 years, that was the sentence. Mark Collins was found guilty of attempted murder in the first degree, 3 counts of wire fraud, and grand larceny. As the bailiffs dragged him away, Mark wasn't crying. He was screaming. He shouted that he had been framed, that his lawyer was incompetent, that the system was rigged against him. The press loved it. The flashbulbs popped like fireworks, capturing the downfall of the Wall Street wolf. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed my parents, hailing the Cook family as heroes of justice. But back at the estate in Greenwich, there was no champagne. There was no victory party. The house was silent, wrapped in the heavy, suffocating quiet of a funeral home. I found Lily sitting on the back porch in an Adirondack chair, staring out at the manicured lawn as the sun began to set. She looked fragile, like a porcelain doll that had been glued back together but was still missing pieces. I walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder. She didn't flinch. "It is over, Lil," I said softly. "He's gone. 28 years. He will be an old man when he gets out. He can't hurt you anymore." Lily didn't look at me. She just shook her head slowly, a tear tracking a lonely path through the scar on her cheek. "You don't understand, Nicole," she whispered, her voice sounding like broken glass. "He took so much more than 28 years. She reached into the pocket of her oversized cardigan and pulled out a small white box. She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside sat a pair of tiny white leather loafers. Infant shoes. I froze. The air left my lungs. "I was going to tell him that night," Lily choked out, the sob finally breaking through her throat. "I was 12 weeks along, Nick. I had just passed the first trimester. We were going to have a baby." My knees gave out, and I sank onto the wooden floorboards beside her chair. The world tilted on its axis. "The doctor said..." Lily gasped for air, her hand clutching her stomach. "The doctor said the hypoglycemic shock caused my body to shut down." And then the impact of the car hitting the divider. The airbag. It was too much trauma. I lost the baby before they even got me out of the wreck. I stared at the tiny shoes, feeling a darkness settle over me that was blacker than any night in a combat zone. Mark hadn't just tried to kill his wife for insurance money. In his greed, in his blind arrogance, he had murdered his own unborn child. That baby was my nephew. That baby was the next generation of our family. Mark Collins wasn't just a thief. He was a monster who had devoured his own flesh and blood. 1 week later, I drove to Ossining, New York. Sing Sing Correctional Facility is a fortress of concrete and steel rising from the banks of the Hudson River. It smells of industrial cleaner, stale sweat, and hopelessness. I went through security, surrendering my phone, my keys, and my belt. I walked into the visitation room, a long gray hall divided by thick plexiglass barriers. Mark was brought in. He looked different. His expensive haircut was gone, replaced by a shaved head that showed the lumpy shape of his skull. He wore a dark green jumpsuit that hung loosely on his frame. He looked gaunt, but as soon as he saw me, that familiar sneer twisted his lips. He sat down, picking up the phone on his side of the glass. I picked up mine. "Come to gloat, Major," Mark said, his voice tinny through the receiver. "Enjoy it while you can. My new lawyer is already filing an appeal. I will be out in 5 years on a technicality." He was still doing it. He was still playing the game, convinced he was the smartest person in the room. I didn't smile. I didn't yell. I looked at him with the flat, dead eyes of someone who has seen too much death to be fazed by a ghost. "I didn't come to gloat, Mark," I said calmly. "I came to give you something." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a single photograph. It was a grainy, black and white ultrasound image. I pressed it flat against the plexiglass, right at his eye level. Mark squinted at it, confusion wrinkling his forehead. "What is this? Some kind of joke?" "Lily was going to tell you the night of the accident," I said, my voice low and steady, driving every word into him like a nail. "She bought a pair of shoes. She cooked your favorite dinner. She was 12 weeks pregnant, Mark." Mark went still, his eyes locked onto the small gray shape in the center of the photo. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. "The insulin you injected caused her body to go into shock," I continued, mercilessly. "The crash finished the job. You didn't just try to kill your wife for a payout. You killed your own child." Mark's hand started to shake. He touched the glass, his fingers tracing the outline of the ultrasound. The arrogance was cracking, splintering under the weight of the truth. "No," he whispered. "No, she never said." "It was a boy." I delivered the final blow. "You killed your son, Mark. You killed your legacy. And for what? To pay off a gambling debt?" I watched the light go out of his eyes. I saw the exact moment his mind broke. The narcissist can justify hurting others, but he cannot justify destroying himself. And his son was an extension of himself. He let out a sound that wasn't human. It was a guttural, strangled cry of pure agony. He slammed his forehead against the glass, sliding down until he hit the metal shelf. "My son," he wailed, rocking back and forth. "Oh God, what did I do? What did I do?" I stood up. I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel relieved. I felt cold. But justice had been served. The prison sentence was just time. This was eternity. I hung up the phone. I turned my back on him. Through the thick, bulletproof glass, I could see his mouth wide open in a scream, his face contorted in madness, but I couldn't hear a thing. I walked out of the prison into the bright, blinding sunlight of the afternoon, leaving Mark Collins alone in the silence of his own hell. Spring came late to Greenwich that year, but when it finally arrived, it exploded in a riot of green and gold. 6 months had passed since the judge banged his gavel, and the silence that now filled our parents' estate was no longer heavy or oppressive. It was the silence of peace. I had officially submitted my paperwork for an honorable discharge from the Army. It was the hardest decision of my life, yet also the easiest. For 2 decades, I had sought purpose in the dusty conflict zones of foreign lands, believing that protecting my country was the highest calling. But looking at the fragile ecosystem of my own family, I realized that the home front had been left unguarded for too long. I wasn't going back to the sandbox. My war was here now. Each morning, instead of gripping the cold polymer of an AR-15 rifle, my hands wrapped around the wooden handle of a garden shovel. I spent my days on my knees in the dirt behind the main house, reclaiming the garden that had been neglected during the chaotic months of the trial. Lily was there with me. She was still thin, and she tired easily, but the color had returned to her cheeks. We worked side by side, pulling up weeds and turning the soil. We planted rows of bright yellow sunflowers and, of course, lilies. Watching those green shoots break through the thawing earth felt like a miracle. After a winter of death and concrete prison walls, seeing life force its way toward the sun was the only therapy I needed. One afternoon, the smell of turpentine and linseed oil wafted from the sunroom. Lily had started painting again. For years, her art had been pretty but superficial. Dreamy landscapes that Mark liked to hang in his office to show off his talented trophy wife. But when she called me in to see her latest piece, I saw that the dreamer was gone. The canvas was large and imposing. It was full of shadows, dark blues and grays that swirled like a storm. But in the center, there was a piercing shaft of light. "It is called The Guardian," Lily said softly, wiping paint from her hands with a rag. I stepped closer. The figure in the painting wasn't wearing camouflage or holding a weapon. It was a woman in a mud-stained flannel shirt, her hands bare and dirty, cupping a tiny, fragile green sprout, shielding it from the encroaching storm. I recognized the jawline. I recognized the fierce, protective hunch of the shoulders. It was me. I stood there, the smell of wet paint filling my nose, and felt tears prick my eyes. I had received medals for valor. I had been commended by generals, but nothing, absolutely nothing, had ever made me feel as seen as this canvas. "I used to think you were scary," Lily admitted, standing beside me. "Now I know you are just safe." That November, Thanksgiving dinner was different. The long mahogany table was set with the good china, just like last year. The turkey was golden brown, and the cranberry sauce was tart and sweet. But the air in the room had changed. There was no Mark Collins sitting at the head of the table, swirling expensive bourbon and making snide comments about my truck or my career. There was no tension making our shoulders tight. There was just the sound of my father laughing at a joke, the murmur of my mother saying grace, and the clinking of silverware. I looked across the table at Lily. The scar on her forehead from the windshield was still there, a thin white line that cut through her eyebrow. It would never fully fade, just like the pain of losing the baby would never fully go away. We didn't talk about the empty chair or the tiny shoes in the box upstairs. We didn't have to. I raised my glass of wine. "To the survivors," I said. My parents and Lily raised their glasses. "And to the fact," I added, a small genuine smile touching my lips, "that living happily is the only way to truly piss off the people who wanted us dead." Lily laughed. It was a real laugh, deep and throaty, not the polite, fearful giggle she used to have. It was the sound of victory. "My name is Nicole Cook. I used to think the battlefield was the only place I belonged. I thought strength was measured in caliber and confirmed kills. But I was wrong. The hardest war you will ever fight is the one to protect the people you love from the cruelty of the human heart." Mark is currently rotting in a 6x8 cell in Sing Sing, staring at cinder blocks and eating processed food, consumed by his own sins. But me? I am busy. I have a garden to tend. I have a sister to help heal. I have a life to build. If you are listening to this story and you feel alone in your own private war, if you feel like the enemy is sleeping in the next room or sitting at your dinner table, I want you to remember this. You are stronger than you think. You are more resilient than they can ever imagine. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't to fire a gun. It is to plant a flower in the scorched earth, stand back, and watch it grow. Before I sign off, I want to leave you with one final briefing. This mission wasn't just about revenge. It was about waking up. Mark didn't destroy Lily overnight. He did it slowly, by isolating her and taking control of her finances under the guise of love. Please remember this. True love never requires you to surrender your independence or your voice. Protecting your assets and maintaining your own safety net isn't an act of distrust. It is an act of self-preservation. If your gut tells you something is wrong in a relationship, listen to it. That instinct is your first line of defense. Never apologize for keeping your guard up. Now, I want to hear from my squad out there. Have you ever had to fight a battle for a loved one against someone they trusted? Or maybe you saw the red flags when everyone else was blind to them? Share your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and your experience might just save someone else who is reading it. If you believe that justice is worth fighting for, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button and smash subscribe to join our community. We are building a platoon of survivors here, and I want you on the front lines for the next story. Stay safe out there. Dismissed.